supposed to talk to y'all about critical race theory and what's going on in schools, so I guess we can try to summarize that. Obviously, it's not possible to define critical race theory. This is what we hear, so that's what we'll do first. Give you a very simple definition that is practicable, but it's not really going to do a lot for you. If you wanted something that's straight out of their literature, I can give you that too. The critical race theory is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. That's it. So if you're getting called racist, or something around you like a school is getting called racist, or a Joe Rogan is getting called racist, or a trucker thing in Canada is getting called racist, what it means is that critical race theorists want control over that thing. That's all it boils down to. That's not a very good definition in terms of academic charity. No critical race theorist would agree that that's what critical race theory boils down to. Do I need to put this by my face? Is this better? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Bye, podium. Okay, I'll start again. So, give you a definition of critical race theory that critical race theorists won't like. It is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. It's not hard to understand. That's what critical race theory boils down to. That's not the definition that they would give. But if you see, as I said just a minute ago, a Joe Rogan or a trucker's convoy or a school or somebody or you or your kid getting called racist by somebody who subscribes to critical race theory, it's probably because the critical race theorist wants to control them. That's what it boils down to. If we want to get a little more accurate, or maybe a lot more accurate, critical race theory is a neo-Marxist theory of race that holds that the fundamental organizing principle of society is racism created by to the benefit of white people. They say that it is embedded in the structure of society. It is the idea that racism actually structures society. In other words, it's the organizing principle of society. And if you understand Marxism, you understand the word structure. And if you understand the word structure, you understand why what critical race theory actually boils down to is race Marxism. It is Marxism using race in place of economic class to do exactly the same thing that Marxism always does. So if I might explain Marxism so you can understand this and agree with me, Marx had a very simple idea about how society works. He believed that there is an upper class, the bourgeoisie, and he believed that there is a lower class, the proletariat, or the working class. His belief was that the working class does all of the legitimate work. They do the productive work that makes society operate. And then the upper class is the managerial class, the priestly class, if they are actually priests or ministers, the lawyers, the managers, all of this kind of boss-type stuff. They don't produce things. They do what I'm doing. They talk. They file paperwork. They push paper around. They mediate. And they create a mythology called ideology that explains why they get to be the bosses and other people have to do the work that feeds them. That's it. The name for that ideology is going to be capitalism or meritocracy, something like this. That these people earned their way. They got educated, they worked hard, they built something, and therefore they have the right to the capital that they have and their property rights. And they get to use that capital how they want, and they get to employ people to do work for them. So other people are telling you that you need to go do productive work so that they can make a profit and they can eat while they do no productive work. So it's a theory of resentment, as you can hear. Now, Marx believed those people in the upper class operate in what he called the superstructure of society. And the people who do all the productive work work in the infrastructure or the base of society. And when you put the superstructure and in the infrastructure next to each other, they create what he called social relations between them, which is how that ideology plays out. That's how the people in charge exploit the people that do the productive work. And that set of social relations that comes from the interplay between upper class and lower class is called the structure of society. This comes from the Marxist theory of structuralism. The structure of society is the social relations created by the fact that there is an upper class and a lower class intrinsically in conflict with one another. Now imagine if you said that society was organized along the lines of some kind of property called whiteness. Whiteness operates as property, Cheryl Harris tells us in 1993. Who's Cheryl Harris? She's a critical race theorist. She writes a paper in 1993, a long legal review article called Whiteness as Property. And she explains that it is a form of private property to have whiteness. It gives you access to the upper levels of society. And in particular, it gives you the fundamental right to exclude. So if you're German coming over, or you're Irish coming over as an immigrant, you're not white until there's some political deal made, then you get to be classified as white because the people who have access to whiteness get to determine who gets access to whiteness or white supremacy or whatever else, and no one else does. If you're black, you're excluded fundamentally by something called anti-blackness, which is intrinsic to whiteness, according to this theory. If you're some other person of color, depends on how you behave. Are you a model minority? Did you behave the right way? You get access to white reward. You maybe get to be white adjacent, if you're Asian particularly. And so now you have an upper class, people who have access to whiteness, and you have a lower class, people of color, who are intrinsically in conflict with one another. You have a racial superstructure that produces an ideology called white supremacy that justifies why that state of affairs is right or just or based in merit. We just worked hard for what we have without ever having to glance at the fact that we excluded people from this or that. Without ever having to examine the role that our ideology has played. This status is called privilege. Meanwhile, you have a lower class that's doing most of the productive, say, cultural work. You've got black people coming up with the blues, and you have Elvis Presley coming as a white guy, repackaging the blues as rock and roll. Cultural appropriation is what that's called. You can't have tacos on Tuesdays anymore. That's culturally appropriating from Latino culture. And so this creates a structure. The people who have access to whiteness are in intrinsic conflict with the people who are excluded from whiteness, according to this theory. That creates a structure called structural racism that is embedded in the law, that is embedded in the language, it is embedded in what we consider to be valid knowledge. It is embedded in all of the different cultural and material artifacts of our society. It is the organizing principle of society at a fundamental level. And what is it? It is racism created by white people for their own benefit. So there's a woman in education by the name of Gloria Ladson-Billings. Some of you, sorry, I just actually had COVID a couple of weeks ago. We're still doing that. There was a woman, if you follow this stuff in education, you'll have heard of Gloria Ladson-Billings. But in 1995, remember, we're told all the time that critical race theory is not in schools, but if we try to ban it in schools, it's a huge problem somehow. Gloria Ladson-Billings in 1995 wrote a paper called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education in 1995, 27 years ago. And in that paper she says, what is critical race theory? Critical race theory exists, she says, to make race the central construct for understanding inequality. Up to that point, the left saw economic class as the central construct for understanding inequality. How? Through structuralism, material structuralism, material determinism, they call this. And it gets replaced with a cultural structuralism. And race is now going to be centered, so that when you see differences by racial category or differences even in economic category that have average outcomes that are different by race, racism is to be taken as the explanation for that disparity. It is the central construct for understanding inequality, according to Gloria Ladson-Billings, telling us what critical race theory exists to do. So what do we have? We have a shifting in the 1990s of recentering how we understand differences and outcomes in society. And we're shifting out of economic class being the key determinant to race being the key determinant under the banner of critical race theory. Why? Because it's race Marxism. Now, if you know anything about Marxism at all, you know that Marxism really exists just to give Marxists control. That's all it exists to do. Marxism doesn't have a single cogent explanation for anything. I mean that. It is an entitlement complex posing as economic theory. It is people who do not know how to run things demanding that they get to run things. And the only way that they get to run them is by giving them the power. This is what critical race theory does. How do I know this? Well, we got Ibram Kendi. You've heard of Ibram Kendi, right? Ibram X. Kendi. You maybe know him by Henry Rogers. I don't know. It's his real name. In 2019, he wrote a little piece for Politico magazine. How do we fix inequality? He says we pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. I can pull out my phone and read this to you if you want me to, if you don't think I'm going to give it to you straight. Let me grab it, actually, so that way you don't think I'm making this up, because this is just ludicrous. I didn't prepare, obviously, to read this, so give me 1 second. How to Fix Inequality by Ibram Kendi. It's 1 paragraph long. Pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. To fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the U.S. Constitution that enshrines 2 guiding anti-racist principles. He misspelled principles. He did. It's the guy at the school is how he spelled it. Racial inequity is evidence of racist policy, and the different racial groups are equals. Okay, so the different racial groups are equals, fine, but hold on. Racial inequity is evidence of racist policy. Differences on outcomes on average by racial group, that's racial inequity. Differences in outcomes on average by racial group is evidence of racist policy. Racism is to be taken as the explanation for all differences in outcomes by constitutional amendment if he gets his way. The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials. Ideas, unconstitutional. I don't know if he read the First Amendment. It would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism, DOA. The jokes write themselves, folks. Comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. Who are formally trained experts on racism? Critical race theorists. Because everybody else that has an opinion about racism is racist, according to critical race theory. So it's going to be composed of critical race theorists. The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity, monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. So it's going to monitor private business and all local, state, and federal policy. Sound like a dictatorship to anybody? Yes, sir, it is. That's correct. The DOA would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policies and ideas. Now, let's go back to Karl. So that's Ibram. Let's go back to Karl. Karl Marx, in 1848, wrote the Communist Manifesto. He said that communism can be summarized in a simple sentence that turns out not to be a sentence: abolition of private property. He says in the same paragraph, he actually says this over and over and over again in the Communist Manifesto, but he says in the same paragraph that he doesn't want to abolish all property, he just wants to abolish bourgeois property. What's the name for bourgeois property in critical race theory? Whiteness. What does Robin DiAngelo tell us? You must strive to be less white. She says there's no such thing as a positive white identity. You have to abolish private property. Whiteness in critical race theory. And then what does Karl say is going to happen? Karl says that history is going to progress along a six-stage trajectory. It's going to start off, there's primitive communism, the tribes in the different places in the world are communistic, they share everything. Eventually some tribes dominate one over another. They declare property rights not just over things but over each other, and the slave economy evolves. This eventually gives way to feudal lords ruling over their estates in what's called an estate economy or an aristocracy. Eventually the serfs, who are the slightly better off but not really better off new slave class, says, no, I can have my own property. I can do my best with my own stuff. I don't have to live on the Lord's land. I can do my part with my stuff, and property rights are extended to everybody. Marx says that actually the property rights is the moment when basically everything in the world went wrong, by the way. That's where the division of labor comes into the world. That's the original sin that Marxism is against, is division of labor, because then you have bosses and you have people that they are exploiting. But because of that exploitative relationship within capitalism, he says all the world's problems aren't solved. And what are we going to have to do? We're going to have the contradictions are going to become more and more apparent. The working class or proletariat is going to awaken to a class consciousness. When it has a class consciousness, it's then going to seize the means of production and institute what? A dictatorship of the proletariat that will create an administered economy in which outcomes are redistributed so they are made equal. Shares are redistributed so that they are made equal. And eventually this will become spontaneous by magic, and we won't have a government doing it for us any longer, and we'll have a stateless, classless utopia called communism at the end of the rainbow. That's Marx's historicism, his 6 stages of history. How does critical race theory see history? Well, in the beginning there were tribes. If you remember the tribe, everybody gets along. Look at how they talk about Native Americans. It doesn't matter what you look like. If they let you into the tribe, you're in the tribe, and everything's shared communally. But then some tribes figured out that they can enslave one another. And we enter into a racial slave economy. And eventually we realize that slavery is a moral abomination, and we have an abolition movement. We end slavery. And what do we enter into? An apartheid state. So you have a racial upper class and a racial lower class in a segregated circumstance. Jim Crow laws, segregation, etc. It's like having an aristocracy and whiteness. And then eventually we have a civil rights movement, and we say, no, we said from the beginning in this country that all men are created equal, and we're going to live up to that promissory note that was written to every American. That was what Martin Luther King said. And we abolish the apartheid state. And we enter into a phase of what? Judging by content of character rather than color of skin. In other words, colorblind equality. And they say, if they're critical race theorists, colorblind equality is the problem. Colorblind equality masks the fact that racism is actually structural. It is actually embedded in the structures, in the law, in the language, in the knowledge of society. And so it reproduces racism. And so what needs to happen? Well, apparently we need a DOA, a dictatorship of the anti-racists, composed of formerly trained experts on racism, who are going to give us an administered racial economy in which equity, the adjustment of shares so that citizens are made equal, will be enforced. And if we let this go long enough with a dictatorship of the anti-racists, it will become spontaneous, and we'll have finally achieved racial justice at the end of the communist rainbow. Equity means socialism. It's a rebranding of socialism using neo-Marxist identity politics. Equity means socialism. Justice means communism. It is a rebranding of the communist project, and if we want to spend an hour talking about the 60s and talking about the neo-Marxists of the 1960s and how they shifted from class to race, we can very easily do that. It's all I've read for the last 2 years. The long and short is that the Marxists of the 50s and 60s figured out that capitalism works. Marx, they said, believed that capitalism would immiserate the worker, but it doesn't. Max Horkheimer told us in 1969, it allows him to build a better life. It does not immiserate the worker. The working class is not a spontaneous basis for a revolution. They can be stabilized. Herbert Marcuse, another Marxist in the 60s, tells us, to be sure, it is a good life, but it's not a perfect life. And then what else does Marcuse tell us? He says, well, we have to look somewhere else. The working class doesn't have revolutionary energy as counter-revolutionary energy. It's conservative. Where can we find that energy? He says, in his own words, in the ghetto populations, in the feminists, in the sexual minorities, in the unemployed, and in the radical student base. And if we could just cobble together a movement out of them, then we can get our revolution. And so the Black Power movement shifts into being fully born under a Black liberation banner. What does liberation mean? Communism. What were the liberation movements? The Viet Cong was the Vietnamese Liberation Front. All the liberation movements of South America, these are led by people like Che Guevara. It's communism. And so the entire radical end of the civil rights movement, which isn't quite what Martin Luther King was doing, gets co-opted by the Marxists for their program to have a revolution. About 20 years later, out of the legal studies movement, critical race theory is born to fulfill this vision. That's what critical race theory is. It is race Marxism. It is a reinvention of Marxism using race instead of class because racial animus doesn't easily stabilize. You can agitate, the workers can agitate for better working conditions, and then they're going to give up their activism. But if you can make people think that their identity itself is under fire and under conflict in society, and you can stoke old wounds, you will never stabilize those people. You will have a constant, perpetual revolutionary base, as Paulo Freire tells us, an education activist, Marxist education activist from Brazil, tells us in a book called The Politics of Education from 1995, that if the revolution is going to be authentic, it must be perpetual. Because the second it stops being revolutionary, it starts being the status quo. And so you're going to agitate people along the axis of identity in order to get them to overthrow their society. To do what? To empower critical race theorists to be our dictators until justice arrives, even though they don't have any tools to get us there. All they sow is division, all they sow is hate, all they sow is crackpot snake oil that does not fix any of the problems. Even if it diagnoses the problems correctly, which it doesn't fix any of them. Everywhere it's been tried, things just get worse. Look at your schools. It doesn't work. If I were speaking as a Christian and this was a sermon, I would tell you to judge them by their fruit.
Yes, sir.
It's simple.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't work. Okay, so what's going on in the schools then? Is it in our schools? Absolutely, it's in our schools. No, they're not coming down and teaching Derek Bell from Harvard Law or Kimberly Crenshaw, who told us that we have to eschew Martin Luther King's vision. Crenshaw, in her paper Mapping the Margins from 1991, tells us there's a fundamental difference, she says, between I am a person who happens to be black and I am black. She says that first one, I'm a person who happens to be black, strains for a certain universality, in effect putting the person first, and says that's a problem. Because it ignores that race is imposed by structural forces. She's a Marxist. She says, I am black, on the other hand, becomes an anchor for subjectivity in a site of a meaningful politic of identity, where the voices of many millions can overwhelm where the voices of a few would not suffice. An anchor for subjectivity, if you understand Marxism, reveals that she's a Marxist. That's what Marxism believes. It believes that you are a subject that's creating in your mind the vision of the world. This is what separates you from the animals. And you say, I want to make this bottle, I want to make this podium, and you have an image of it in your mind, and then you bring it into being in the world, and then you see yourself in the object you have created, and you see yourself as creator. So you throw down God and replace him with yourself as creator. How? By realizing that you are a subject, and as a subject you are meant to live in a society. Social man, or socialist man, he called it. And what does Kimberly Crenshaw tell us? I am black is an anchor for subjectivity and a fruitful site for a meaningful politic of identity. That's what this is about. And so what are they doing? Are they teaching Kimberly Crenshaw in the schools? No. They're teaching people to see their race as an anchor for subjectivity in a Marxist conflict theory of race. They are raising a racial consciousness. They tell you we have to have race-conscious admissions in schools. We have to have race-conscious lessons. You'll even hear them explicitly say we have to raise a critical consciousness in our students. What is a critical consciousness? What is this race consciousness about? Is it just recognizing that some people have different skin colors and that history has not been particularly great in all ways? No. It means to think about race in terms of societal structures. It means to think of yourself as positioned within societal structures due to forces beyond your control, the playthings of discourses, the playthings of the structures of society, the systemic racism that was created by white people for their own benefit and their privilege, so they're blind to it, and it takes somebody with critical consciousness to point that out to them. It exists to create activists who think this way. They tell you this themselves, repeatedly. Why? Because a critical theory, which is also known as a critical Marxist theory, literally, which came from the Frankfurt School, which is named the Institute for Social Research, which was originally named the Institute for Marxism, but they changed the name because it was a little too on the nose. A critical theory is, by definition, something that upholds an idealized vision for society, justice, that criticizes the existing society for not living up to that vision. It does not offer a pathway to get to that vision. All it does is criticize. As Marx had it, ruthless criticism of all that exists. As Marcuse had it, negative thinking, which he says will become positive. As Horkheimer, who I mentioned a moment ago, said, it is not possible for us to say what a good society looks like, but it is possible to criticize the one we live in. This is all it does, is complain. And third, a critical theory must inspire praxis. It must inspire social activism on behalf of that idealized utopian vision. This is what they're teaching your children with critical race theory. They're teaching them that racial privilege is how you think about your racial position against the structure of society. They're telling them that if you have access to whiteness, you have access to privilege, and that this makes you willfully ignorant, and that you need to learn and check your privilege. You need to shut up and listen, do the work. If you happen to be any other race who doesn't have access to whiteness, you are to be told that you are victimized by this set of structural circumstances beyond your control. That which doesn't go right in your life isn't your fault, it's the entire system's fault. Responsibility is not the pathway out of this. Freire tells us this explicitly. The pathway out of dependency cannot be responsibility, he says, because that would only lead the people who take responsibility to climb out and betray everybody they left behind. It's solidarity to overthrow the entire system. And who's going to be in charge? The critical race theorists. Because they're the only ones who have the requisite consciousness raised in order to do it. But this is so far down the list of how bad what they're doing in the schools is. This is what people focus on. Now, I've talked about critical race theory a few minutes. I have no idea what time it is. I'm going to tell you about queer theory. Let me tell you about queer theory. All this, can I swear in Kansas? All this shit that we just heard from race, they did it with sex, gender, sexuality, mental health status, fat status, and ability status as well under a banner of queer theory. Queer means that which is not normal by definition. That which is excluded from the normal. That which is without essence by definition. So anything that's accepted, gay marriage, we accept gays, normative, bad. And the queer theorists have been fighting against marriage equality from the 80s and the 90s. Ask anybody who fought for it in the trenches and they'll tell you. It is the idea that nothing can be made normal. And so, queer theory has this idea that your children, if they are subscribing to normativity, if they're upholding normativity, if they are acting in terms of anything that the broader society considers normal, they are upholding oppression. It's a stratified society. You see, there are the normal people, they're like the bourgeoisie, and then there's the abnormal people, and they're like the proletariat. and they need to have a queer consciousness raised. Hannah Dyer tells us the point of queer theory is not to create stable LGBTQ identities. It is to make sure that they don't become stable identities, that they remain fluid, that they are not given an essence, so that your children, and they take this stuff up under gender theory or comprehensive sex education or whatever else, are never quite able to get their feet under them and know who they actually are. It completely breaks down your mind. Wonder why the kids have so much anxiety, depression, social anxiety, suicide? Because they don't know who they are. They have no basis to find out who they are. Now, why on earth would anybody want to do this? Well, let me tell you about a Hungarian Marxist by the name of George Lukács, who you probably have never heard of. George Lukács was the deputy commissar for education in the short-lived Hungarian regime in 1919. Made it about 4 months, and the Hungarians got so pissed off, they chased these people out of power. And as the deputy education commissar, Lukács put in a program that's very much like what we see today under comprehensive sex education and genderbread theory, or whatever they call it. He realized that if you destabilize the children sexually, that they will reject their parents, that they will reject their parents' religion, that they will reject the customs and traditions of their culture as old-fashioned, as not understanding them for who they are. So he taught children how to masturbate in school, and he taught children to have sex, and he showed them pornographic images, which is exactly what's happening in American schools today. It's George Lukács' program being put back into play now in the United States, which is why if you talk to an Eastern European about what's going on in the schools, they lose their freaking minds. They've seen it before, and it works. George Lukács is probably the most influential of what we're called the cultural Marxists. Cultural Marxists, if you go on Wikipedia, does not exist. They replaced the entry about 2 years ago, and it no longer exists, and is replaced by an entry for cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. It doesn't exist any longer. It is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, according to Wikipedia now. George Lukács was a cultural Marxist. In other words, he knew that if you wanted to get a Marxist revolution in a Western society, you have to undermine their culture through Marxist techniques first. These techniques were taken up by a particularly famous Chinese person by the name of Mao Zedong. Now, we could talk a lot about the history of Mao Zedong and how the Nationalist Party was rising to power, and Chiang Kai-shek was kind of a brutal socialist nationalist. And then the CCP kind of rose up from within. It turns out they used something exactly like critical race theory, by the way, to destabilize the Nationalist Party. They said that the Nationalist Party was trying to homogenize China under this term Huarun, which means Chinese person. And therefore what they said was, actually they're trying to make you all Han. They're centering Han-ness as the default for humanity, or default for China. And so the 55 minority races of China are being racially exploited. And they literally did critical race theory between the 1920s and the 1950s in China, or late 1940s in China, to destabilize the population. And they eventually overthrew the Kuomintang, that's the Nationalist Party, took over power, did the Great Leap Forward, dumped society into a terrible hole, millions, tens of millions dead, absolute catastrophe. We call it the Great Reset this year. I mean, seriously. And so Mao gets chased out of power, comes back, and wages what's known now from 1966 to 1976 as the Cultural Revolution. And now you're going to understand why I wanted to bring up a little queer theory alongside, because critical race theory is way down here in terms of how bad what it is in our schools going on. Queer theory, as bad as that is, like all the suicides and your kids cutting off their boobs and stuff, it's only in the middle. So when you put them together that you get up to the top. Because what they're reproducing is Mao Zedong's program. What Mao did was he separated society into 10 categories. 5 of them were labeled black, those were bad. 5 of them were labeled red for communism, that was good. Black identities would be things like landlord, wealthy farmer, counter-revolutionary, bad influence, those kind of things. I can't remember all 5, so I had to say 4 of them. And the red identities were things like peasant, laborer, revolutionary, Red Guard, which is a activist for Mao's program. By the way, they literally destroyed statues infiltrated churches and temples and raided them and destroyed all the art, all the artifacts, all the sacred objects. They beat their parents, they beat their teachers, they beat their grandparents to death as teenagers. They paraded people around in struggle sessions and shamed them, beating them in the street to embarrass them for having possibly counter-revolutionary ideas or being associated with a landlord or something like that. But you can imagine where this came from. It was in the schools. So if you happen to be a property owner in China, your son or daughter goes to school and gets labeled with a black identity and then gets told, if you become one of our Red Guard, you can have a red identity. You become an activist for us, you can have a red identity. And so now you got critical race theory in America. So if you're white, you're the worst kind of person. Your objective is to be less white. There's no such thing as a positive white identity, and you need to be aware of it. You need to have a racial consciousness. You need to learn the honest history, which is just a historiography where they tell a fake history, a revisionist history. Look up critical race theory on Wikipedia, since obviously they're very leftist, as we just talked about, and you'll see that they actually tell you that revisionist history is actually a pillar of critical race theory behavior. They revise history to tell an activist story. And so you got the poor white girls especially, who are the worst kind of person. But man, if you were bisexual, that's a good identity. You transition, that's a good identity. You become an ally, that's a good identity. You give people a bunch of shame for being straight, white, male, white woman also, white adjacent, healthy, not mentally ill. You bully them relentlessly for this under brand names like social emotional learning. And then you give them a bunch of ways out. Transition. Adopt some demisexual tree self pronouns. Be an ally. But you have to have not a stable identity, but a politicized identity. You want to be an ally, you have to have a politicized racial identity. You want to become LGBT or Q, it shall not be stable and it needs to be political. You have to be an activist. The point of queer theory, Hannah Dyer told us, is not to create a stable LGBTQ identity, it is to create activists. Destabilized activists with your children. As Ayanna Pressley told us, it's not enough to have black faces who are not black voices. We don't want brown faces who don't want to be brown voices, she told us. What does that mean? Well, because your racial characteristics, in fact, your character, remember that judged by contents of character, not color of skin thing? You can't. Because your character is determined by the structural forces, because it's Marxism, that's how it believes everything works. The social relations determine your character. They determine the limits of your subjectivity, the limits of who you can understand yourself to be and what you can be in this world. And so that structural determinism gives you what they call a unique voice of color or a unique voice of sexuality. And it just so happens to be that the unique, authentic voice is what the critical theorist of that identity Marxism says it is. If you're black face, you have to have a critical race theory voice about what it means to be black. If you're Asian, you have to have a critical race theory voice about what it means to be Asian. If you're Latino, you have to have a critical race theory idea of what it means to be Latino, but of course that means you have to be Latinx, because queer theory colonized that too. If you are gay, you have to be an activist. It is not enough for you to be who you are. It shall not be stabilized. You have to become an activist. You have to use the relevant critical theory of identity. Otherwise, you're acting white. You're seeking male approval. You're upholding cis heteronormativity. You are the worst kind of person. And so what they're doing is they're using these different theories to beat people over the head with one hand and give them a refuge with the other, a safe space with the other. And what they're doing is using that to radicalize your kids into becoming activists. Can't read. 30% of our kids can read, but it doesn't matter. They know how to complain. Can't do math, but by goodness, they're not going to offend anybody except people who are on the wrong side of history, and they deserved it. Remember that thing, by the way, that wrong side of history? Remember that thing I told you where Marx said it's going to progress through these 6 stages of history? Being on the wrong side of history means you're not helping that. It means you're not a Marxist. That's all it means. You're on the wrong side of history or you're on the right side of history is an article of religious eschatological faith for Marxists. It is your duty to be on the right side of history. In other words, to bring about the revolution, which is like a moment of rapture. After which there will be this difficult time, kind of a tribulation, and then the kingdom will be reestablished. It's a very religious kind of mentality. And they are grooming your children into this in the schools. This is what's going on with this. The tool that I said that they're using to do this, they've got lots of things. They say critical race theory is not in school. CRT, they have CRT, culturally relevant education, or teaching, culturally responsive teaching, culturally sustaining teaching, culturally competent teaching, cultural competency. They use that word a lot, cultural. It's a red flag. Transformative is another one. So there's this thing called social emotional learning that they're using in the schools. Ethnic studies is another program they use in the schools to shuttle this stuff in. It depends on your state. California's had mandatory ethnic studies in K through 12 for about a year now, but it's had mandatory ethnic studies in universities since the late 60s. Ethnic studies is just shuttling this stuff in. But social emotional learning has evolved from something that was designed to help troubled kids. You have a kid who's got trouble at home, struggles with his math lesson, and he gets all pissed off and can't focus, and he throws a little fit, has learning issues, and there used to be trained counselors that would teach them social and emotional learning. They would teach them to deal with the social challenges of being in school, dealing with the emotional issues that they have, either due to the work, due to homework or whatever, the kids, the parents, maybe they're getting beat at home or something, who knows. And it was very successful. And the frickin' Marxists colonized this and created what they call transformative social emotional learning, which uses the exact same model, except now it's not done by a counselor dealing with a troubled kid. All the kids are troubled. Every one of them has trauma, so you just do it in the classroom, in a big group setting with everybody. Uncontrolled environment. Should be illegal. In fact, the people doing this should be in prison. I fully mean that. It's psychological abuse of children to break them down, to feed them then, under transformative social emotional learning, a critical consciousness. And in the exact same structure I just gave you. You are teaching them that there are certain identity categories that are bad, that are black, if we were Mao, and there are certain identity categories that are good, that are red, that they can adopt, if we were Mao, that they can adopt, and they can be on the right side of history. They can be doing the right thing. All they have to do is take up a program of bullying the other kids and telling their parents to stuff it and abandon their religion and abandon their culture and hate America. Because this is a white supremacist, cis heteronormative, blah, 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 ist culture. And on the other side of the revolution, everything's going to be great for people like them. It's just that nobody understands now. So this is what's really going on in our schools. Critical race theory and queer theory and the other identity Marxist theories that I would generally call woke Marxism are being used in kind of tandem with one another under brand names and with other tools like social emotional learning to bully your kids into becoming activists for the revolution. Marxists and Maoists. Why do you think they cancel? Why do you think they put kids and other people through struggle sessions? Joe Rogan's going through a struggle session right now. Try to get him to stand up and humiliate himself, to apologize, to grovel. And then the second that he does, they let him off the hook. No, they hit him harder. In China, they made you wear a dunce cap, paraded you around in the street, whipped you and beat you. Sometimes they killed you. Whoops. Only like 100 million people died in the Cultural Revolution. And you think it can't happen here? Critical race theory has lost virtually all of its clout in our society in 1 year due to people, I'm proud to say like myself, that have exposed it, but it has not lost any of its grip on the schools. Because they understand, just like Hitler understood, what are you? You're going to pass away, and we have your children. They understand that if they don't get the revolution now, that the kids that are 8 and 9 years old that they're doing this to right now are going to turn 14 and 15 one day and be ready to come out and beat their parents to death, beat their grandparents to death, and to pave the way for the revolution. Marx told us, violence is the midwife of the revolution. That's what he said. Why are they so hell-bent on doing this to your children? Because it's the only damn way it can work now that we know what it is. They have so much power and influence over kids. Kids literally don't know better. And no matter how well you raise them, they spend a lot of time with trusted authority figures in these schools, half of whom literally don't even know that this is what they're doing to them. Some of the administrators know what they're doing bringing this in. A lot of the teachers don't. This is just what you're doing. We're just trying to teach honest history. We haven't really ever taught about slavery, which is absurd. Obviously absurd. So I started off by saying that critical race theory is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. I'll give you a definition for critical race theorist. A liar. A Marxist and a liar. That's using racial agitation through a Marxist conflict theory that centers race as the central construct for understanding all inequality, so that they can empower themselves to raise racial consciousness so that they can create little revolutionaries who are going to overthrow the existing society so that they can be empowered to lead us through to some glorious revolution that they think is going to work this time. The good news is they're getting used. And they're getting used too. Because the people that are really pulling this are really big banks that have figured out that if they put this social theory crap, they look good while they get to break up all possible opposition to themselves. And if they incorporate it in, say, what you might call a social justice score that you can give to a company in terms of its stock profitability, or to an institution like a university or a school in terms of how socially progressive it is, an S score. And maybe you score them on environmental scores, an E score, and maybe you look at how they organize themselves, and did they bring in diversity, equity, and inclusion officers. You can give them a good G score, and you have these ESG metrics that people like Vanguard and BlackRock and Goldman Sachs, all these big banks that don't want to get busted up for all the illegal crap they've been doing for a few decades, they can look real good while installing a social credit system so that they can control you by removing you from access to your own bank account if you don't do what they say. Of course, the funny part is, critical race theorists are inherently destabilizing. Guess who's going in the digital gulag first? Them. They're getting used too. But unfortunately, they're using your children, and they're facilitating the destruction of everything that America's about, and it has to stop. It absolutely has to stop. It's not teaching honest history, it's teaching literally dishonest history to agitate. They say that we have whitewashed history, they're teaching red-washed history. It is Marxist history. It is a lie. The 1619 Project is a distortion of the facts. Every historian worth their salt agrees that it's a distortion of the facts, and they say the facts don't matter. The goal is not to be objective. It's to offer a different perspective on history. It's lies, because critical race theorists are liars. They're Marxist liars. The goal is not to teach honest history. It's not to teach about slavery. It's to teach things in particular ways that will make your children turn into revolutionary activists for a Marxist agenda. And the reason is because it helps these huge banks that are going to screw them over and enslave them for the rest of their lives, along with us. But who cares when it comes to the kids? They're number one. So if you want to know what critical race theory is, you know what critical race theory is now. If you want to know why critical race theory is in the schools, you know why critical race theory is in the schools now. What do? You have to get it out of the schools. In fact, I would tell you, you have to get your children out of the schools first. The children are in a burning building. You do not try to figure out how to put the fire out before you get your kid to safety. Protect your children from this menace. Start flipping school boards. Start firing superintendents. Start removing people in state government who put this in play or who protect the people putting it in play. Vote them out, sue them, whatever it takes within every legal means. And I mean that, because I didn't really want to talk about this, but I'm all mad at these people right now. There is a reactionary right-wing movement flaring up as well, and not that way, Western man. Keep it legal. Lawsuits, elections, recalls, petitions, keep it legal, but get them out of power. Critical race theorists, as one example, exist to do one thing and one thing only, which is to make critical racial consciousness in whoever they can get a hold of and turn every institution into a project for making more critical race theorists. That's all they exist to do. They will not stop. They will not stop because you ask them to stop. They will not stop because they're called out. They will actually have to be made to stop. They have to be removed from the positions of power that they are abusing. And it's not cancel culture. It is not canceling somebody to remove them from a position of power they are abusing. That's called responsibility, not cancellation. Cancellation is when you remove somebody from a position because you bullied them out for no good reason. Because you're mad at them and can gin up a mob. It's not a mob to make people not abuse your kids. So, what do? Show up. Start organizing locally. You guys are here. That's the first step. I've been all over the country. I've been to like 30-something states this past 12 months. People are showing up everywhere. It's a simple pattern. Start getting together. Meet somebody while you're here tonight. It could be me, but I don't live here, so it's not very useful. Meet somebody while you're here tonight. Start getting together. And as you start to get together, start to get informed. And after you start to get more informed, how? Read some stuff. Go read Critical Race Theory and Introduction. Go listen to stuff on my podcast that I heard in the introduction. Go look up anybody that's talking about this. It's fine. It doesn't have to be me. It can be me. I don't care. Share resources with one another. Get informed. And when you get informed, get organized. Because now you know what you're looking at and what you're doing. And when you get organized, start showing up. Show up to school board meetings. Look at, for example, the state of Utah. They created an organization called Utah Parents United, and in a very short amount of time had almost 30,000 parents and grandparents banded together to share information about what's going on in the schools and to show up to school board meetings, to show up to county commission meetings, to city council meetings, to show up to legislature meetings, committee meetings, and so forth. 30,000 of them. They put some crazy initiative into play at one of these things. 4,000 some odd parents showed up and grandparents showed up. All of a sudden the board was a little bit like, wait a minute, what's going on? Let's not vote for that. And it works. So start getting organized and start taking action. Take smart, strategic, legal action. What do you do as an individual? You have to, again, I don't mean to sound like a preacher, but you got to find your gifts of the Spirit. You got to figure out what you can do. One of the most moving things that I saw was this. I went to this event in Wisconsin, and there's this older man there, and I got talking to him, and he got asking me some question, and I went off on some tangent to theory, the poor guy. And he stopped me about a minute or two in. You know, he was real polite, and he said, I don't know what in the world you're talking about. And I said, but I thought you like, sorry, I thought you were like, you know, one of the guys or whatever. He was like, I'm stupid. I do errands. These guys need copies made. They need people run back and forth to the airport. They need, you know, whatever little clerical thing. Somebody's got to do it. I do that. Some other lady's talking about how she chimes in. She says something about how she does a bake sale. You got to find what you can do. Not everybody's going to go read all this Marxist crap and talk about it. There's a few of us that will. Helps when people invite us places. Helps when people support the people who invite us places to make those things kind of work. You know, if you got parents showing up, if you got people wanting to do, you know, legal work, all that stuff takes time, it takes money, it takes organization. There's an activist woman I know where one of the things, all she does is make sure, you know, there's a meeting or whatever, a legislative meeting or something. She gets a list of people who are going to show up and give testimony, and she calls them. Hey, by the way, you go on in about half an hour. Don't forget. Hey, later today, right? You're still going to be there, 5 o'clock. That's all she does. She just makes sure the people that she's getting organized to show up to say something actually remember to show up and say stuff, because people are busy. And I thought, this lady is wonderful. I need somebody like this in my life if I'm going to show up and do stuff. That could be you. So what do you have to do? You have to figure out what it is that you can do. Maybe you're going to stand up and you're going to speak. Maybe you got something you can say, so you stand up and speak. Maybe you understand and you can read complicated material and you can explain it to other people, so read it and explain it to people. Maybe you're the one baking cookies and making a couple $100 that helps pay for some of the fees around the lawyer or whatever else who's going to represent somebody in your school and protect our kids. Maybe it's you're going to help out with whatever little errands that are needed for somebody who's a good person who wants to run for school board and flip over one of these corrupt seats. There's lots of things you can do. Maybe you're just helping your kids and the other kids in your neighborhood have a place where they can go to hear something different from this stuff, if they're getting it especially hours and hours a day at school. I remember there's a young woman, a friend of my daughter's, that came over one time and she got all weird and then was like, "Can I tell you something?" And I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "I know you're the only person I could tell this to." And she said, "I can't believe I'm going to say this." She got all tense and she said, I'm not doing the pronoun thing anymore." And it was like a ton of bricks off of her back that she finally had somebody she could confess that to. And you have to realize how many kids feel this way. And adults, they feel like they can't tell a single person they think this stuff is crazy or dangerous, or that they don't want to participate in it, that they don't have a single person that they could confess that to. You could be that person. In Wisconsin, there are people that I met that all they do is they organize things for kids in the neighborhood to play together again. That had more to do with COVID than all this other stuff. But what does it do is it gets the kids playing together, the kids are making a network, the parents are working together now. And the next thing you know, they're organizing and they're taking over a school board again, or they're taking over the county council. This is the kind of stuff. Everybody's got to get active locally. Everybody's got to get active locally now. We've got to start looking. It's 2022. I hate to be this way. I hate to get political, but we've got to start figuring out who the right people to have in office are. And we have to start supporting those people. You can believe me, the regime realizes that the Democrats have done screwed up. They're not real popular right now. Therefore, what are they going to do? Put in Republican shills. Better know some good people who can beat them in the primaries. Better know some good people who can get in their offices before they get surrounded like President Orange did. He did. He got surrounded by a bunch of Paul Ryan in his presidential office and they filled him with the swamp all around him and all this crap. Who knows what he would have done if he didn't have that. You got to have good people. Somebody's got to vet these people. This is necessary. This election cycle is going to probably, unless there's something really shady going on, be the biggest red wave maybe ever. But it doesn't need to, you must understand that the machine is going to try to make sure that do-nothings get in there, and then there are going to be crazy radical people here and there that are going to run that we do not want winning office. They're going to say some of the right stuff and they're going to sound real strong, but they're scary. We need good people, finding good people, maybe it's you, maybe it's not, to fill these offices. So these are a lot of different kinds of things you can do, but most importantly, what you must understand is you must do something. This is the fight of our lives. It is the fight for our children. It is the fight for the future of this country and their role and place in it. And if you drop this ball, they lose completely. You have to do something. So that's what I'll leave you with. We have to win. We must win. This is a cultural revolution. Thank you.
So we have a 1 hour and 1 block. It's a little past 10 right now almost. If you're up for some questions, I think we've probably got about 20, 25 minutes for some questions. I think we're in a small enough crowd here. I think we should hopefully be able to hear your questions, but if not, I can bring the mic to you. So who would like to start us off first? Yes, sir.
I'm Reverend S. Willis Walker, and I pastor the Christ Fellowship Baptist Church in Kansas City, Inner City Church, and I'm a conservative talk show host on a liberal station. Can you believe that? This is our future president of the Baptist Ministers Union in Kansas City, Dr. John Sidney Jones, pastor of Highland Baptist Church. question to you is, I try hard to get the urban pastors, they're actually preaching social justice in a lot of these churches. And I try hard to get them to understand what's going on. And like tonight, I had a bunch of pastors I invited, he was the only one that showed up out of the urban core. And I'm frustrated because I'm on a little station, but I have the #1 ratings on the station among talk shows. And so people are beginning to listen to me, and I'm willing to give anybody a platform that will help me get the word out to the urban areas. You know, I'm tired of seeing people in our congregation that are victims. That's all we hear. You a victim. And Donald Trump's a racist. And you know, all that stuff, that's all they hear. And they don't hear from our side over here. I live over here in Johnson County. They don't hear from my side over here. They hear what the preachers are preaching to them over there. They hear from community activists. I want to know, how can I help? I have a platform. I got 100,000 listeners on Carter Broadcasting Network. How can I help? If anybody can help me and get it organized and get people like you to come downtown, I'd be willing to do it.
It's going to sound a little corny, but the truth is that you just keep telling the truth. That's what you do. You don't let, so there's a famous guy from the Soviet Union that lived underneath all this. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is his name. And he wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago. And he says in there, he says, let the lie come into the world, let it triumph even, but not through me. And so what you absolutely must do is you have to tell the truth. You have to tell the truth, you have to keep telling the truth. I mean, you're a minister of the gospel, so you understand. Not everybody's going to believe that when they hear it. And what do? You keep telling them. You keep telling them, and you live it. And you show them. And so, yeah, you want to get on the radio, let's do it. You know, no problem. We've got some other friends we can connect you to. We'll get some other guys. What you want to do is look for voices, the people that you think your listeners are going to be able to connect to. Get those voices, get them to tell the truth. You can't hedge around this. You've got to tell the whole truth every single time. You got to tell them a message of hope, and you got to tell them a message that resonates, that, look, I'll put it as simply as I can, it's drawing straight from the mistake they make in their own literature that I referenced here in my talk. People are in a situation where they feel like they're in dependency. And maybe they are. You got to get people that they're starting to understand, maybe I'm in a situation of dependency. And you have to convince them. This is so important, that there are two paths that people are offering out of dependency. One path is responsibility, and one path is solidarity to blow up the system. And the one that's going to blow up the system is actually not designed to get anybody out of dependency. It's designed to empower a very small handful of people to become the new slave masters of this entire world. If you teach somebody, on the other hand, responsibility, they can raise themselves up out of whatever situation that they're in, and they don't have to follow a path of blame. It's not easy. But if you can frame it in terms of these two ideas, if you're in a state of dependency, you can either be resentful or you can take responsibility. You can have a real strong winning message that a lot of people are going to start to understand. But the hard part is you're going to have to overcome the idea that they're betraying people by taking responsibility for their own situation, because that's the poison that they get sold. And I think it's so important for people to be preaching. And if you got the gospel behind you, use it. You got to be preaching consistently that responsibility is the pathway out of dependency. That if every single person who wants to take it, then we're going to raise a whole bunch of ships together. But if you go the other route, what it does, you call it equity if you want. Equity equalizes downward. All it does is it makes equal by bringing everything down. And so maybe that message will resonate, I don't know. But what you have to do is you have to tell the truth, and you have to put it in terms that they're going to understand. You got to bring in voices that they're going to be able to hear. And just do it consistently. I mean, I don't mean to, because, you know, I don't want to step on any toes. I'm talking to a minister here. It's the same as preaching the gospel. If you think the gospel is the capital T truth, you're going to go preach it, you're going to say it, you're going to do it, you're going to not apologize for it, you're not going to cut it short or say it halfway, and you're just going to keep trying to bring people to that truth. It's the same thing. That's what I would say.
What radio station?
KPRT 1590 AM 106.1 FM.
I would say it back, but that's more than I can remember.
I got a card.
So
come on every Tuesday, every Saturday at 2 p.m. on 106.1 FM and 1590 AM. And you can go to if you got a Facebook page, you can go to Focus for Life Group radio show, and you'll see all my materials on Facebook and on YouTube also.
Can you say your name again?
S. Willis Walker. Yeah, Stephen is my first name, but everybody call me Stevie Wonder as I do this.
Right. We've got another question back here.
I wanted to ask, taking all this, internalizing it, and I'm Cuban, and so I know this culturally because my parents lived under Castro, et cetera. But to take this and give it to the next generation, is there material out there or something that they can process and internalize themselves so that they can see deception that you know of? Because some of it will be coming from me and it's like, oh, whatever. So yeah.
No, actually, unfortunately not that I know of. I think that this has been a concerted effort within our education system broadly. I said that we've got red-washed education, and I fully mean it. We know, and this is great, I'm not criticizing this one bit, we know more than anybody on the planet should ever need to know about how the Nazis worked. We know all about that. We don't know a damn thing about communism. You pick any young person in America that's not paying attention to kind of the culture war. They've never heard of Mao. They don't have the slightest idea what Lenin or Stalin or a Bolshevik is. They don't know who Trofim Lysenko is. Trofim Lysenko is a biologist and an agriculturalist that they used in the Soviet Union and then was picked up later, his work was picked up later in China, whose work is directly responsible for the starvation death of possibly over 100 million people. Nobody's heard of him. What we need is robust anti-communist education. President Trump got up and said, we're going to have patriotic education. Everybody out there lost their minds. Maybe we need patriotic education, I don't know. But I know we need anti-communist education. We need to have materials put together perhaps by people like yourself who lived with this. We need to have materials put together first of all, we've got to fight our way out of this problem with the schools. But as we come out of this, our curriculum has to treat communism in virtually identical terms to the way that we treat Nazism. Every child in this country should grow up knowing that communism does not work. Marxism is an abject failure, and it will lead to the murder of millions of people every time it is tried. And so I don't have anything to tell you about what exists. What I have is a challenge for people like yourself to start making it. This education needs to get out there. I know there is a contingent of Chinese Americans right now who are working very hard to try to create material about the Cultural Revolution, many of whom were actually Red Guards when they were children. And this is absolutely necessary. So my charge is that if you have skill in educational pedagogy, and if you have relevant history, or you know people who do, this is one of those things that can start getting organized for us. Start finding the relevant experts that are going to teach a genuine anti-communist education in the United States and start getting curriculum prepared, and then start getting good states like the state of Kansas to pick it up. I can't say anything. I'm supposed to make fun of Missouri, I heard on this side. Can't say anything about that side. I don't know. No, that's state too. All the states. California, to pray for them or something. But all the rest of them. So no, I don't know any, but we need it. We need it bad.
So our next question's back here, and folks, just so you know, keep your hands up. I'll kind of work my way around the room for you and get to you. So we got a few more questions.
How long has the critical race theory been taught in America? Because it's been a lot longer than people think. It's been a long time. And I have one more thing to say. LGBTQ stands for Let's Get Biden to Quit.
So that's a hard question to answer because it's been taught in different places at different times in different quantities. Sometimes critical race theory colonizes existing programs. Certainly something like the kind of nascent beginnings of critical race theory have been taught in the state of California, for example, in the university system, although it wasn't technically critical race theory wasn't named until 1989. So technically nothing was critical race theory before 1989. But the ethnic studies program that's been in California since the 60s late 60s, I think 68 or 69, it was passed into law that the University of California system has to teach it, has incorporated those same lessons. The first manual that was written in what we would consider critical race theory now for education was written in 1973 by a woman named Patricia Bidall, who is also the creator of the prejudice plus power definition of racism. She also said that whiteness is a form of schizophrenia. She also said you're either racist or anti-racist. That didn't just come out of the ground recently. But she wrote a book in 1970 it's very difficult to find, and I can't remember its title. But in 1971, right after that, the National Education Association, the NEA, the teachers unions, literally commissioned her to write the first manual to bring whiteness studies, as we would call it today, into education. And she was at American University at some point. I don't know exactly which states would have adopted that and when. I also know that Norman, Oklahoma, People's Republic of Norman, they call it there in Oklahoma City, has been putting out similar material at least since 1978. Judith Katz was a significant professor there. She wrote a book in 1978 called White Awareness that basically rehashed Bidall's work. Judith Katz is the sole citation on that infographic about white supremacy culture that the National African American History Museum for the Smithsonian put out a year or so ago and got blown up all over social media for, and they took it down. It said that things like punctuality and loyalty and hard work and things like that are white supremacy culture. So I would say, to put it at a guess, some of the themes of critical race theory in certain states like California, Oregon, and Washington, maybe to a degree New York and Massachusetts, those would be by far the earliest adopters. At least since the 1970s, there's been critical race theory present in the schools. In states like mine in Tennessee, I would say that it was probably more just in the last 5 or 6 years. So it's going to vary incredibly depending on the state where and how much critical race theory has been in. But this push has been extremely hard since primarily 2011, when the Obama administration was putting a lot of this stuff into the educational changes. But actually a little earlier than that, George Bush's educational reforms brought a lot of these kinds of themes into the schools as well. But 2011 and 12, with the Obama administration, become extraordinarily significant with revamping education to bring this in. And obviously, since George Floyd died, it's been pedal to the metal, because apparently that was going to be the impetus for making the revolution.
Next question here. Well, this is more of somebody who has some information for us on the curriculum that's counter to this.
So I have a private Montessori school, faith-based Montessori school up in KCK. And so with the advent of COVID last year, I had a large influx of children from the Shawnee School District, Blue Valley. I mean, they came all the way up to me. And I think a lot of those children were very angry because they instinctively feel that everything they're being told is incorrect. So I would just say engage your children. How do you feel about this? Does this feel fair? Does this feel right? And the Founders Keep out of Leavenworth, if you are homeschooling or if you have like a pod school or something, they are providing free curriculum about accurate American history for homeschoolers, and I can connect you with them. They just have stacks of books. They've been trying to find people to give it to because they want to preserve the Constitution and the correct history. So
that's great. That's great to hear. I will add, actually, somebody told me this recently, and it's up to you how much you want to be subversive to your kids' schools, their teachers and things. But this guy told me recently that the game that they play when he picks up his kids from school every day now, they get in the car and it's, all right, kids, what happened in Clown World today? And then they literally spend till dinner time making fun of, because the kids, you're exactly right, the kids intuit something with this is completely bogus. It's actually, it turns out, people who are in their 20s right now, especially upper half of their 20s and early 30s, who've been kind of hooked into this, kind of tying into how long has this been in schools. They're hooked into it way more. The younger kids, the ones who are actually in school, are very frequently kind of tapped into the fact that this is bogus. So feel entirely encouraged to, even my wife, when our kids were growing up, we used to say we'd have to deprogram them from some of the stuff they learned in school. Feel absolutely free to make fun of it. What happened in Clown World today, kids? Tell us the crazy stuff they tried to peddle off on you.
My name is Mitchell O'Reilly. I'm a 16-year-old student at Belton High School over in Missouri. What can I do to help stop critical race theory being taught at my school?
Yes.
Good for you, man. Good for you. What I would tell you is the same thing I told the pastor. You've got to tell the truth. So if you show up to a school board meeting, a lot of times kids don't go. And I don't mean to call you a kid, now you're 16. But you get me, right? A lot of times students don't go. You can go too. There are a lot of videos that have gone viral. So what you can do, get informed on what you think you want to say, and then, show up. You get 2 or 3 minutes, ask for a chance, sign up to speak, get involved in the process, learn what that looks like right now. The other thing, that's something you can do that's kind of bigger and more practical. Make sure somebody films that thing, put it on the internet. You probably have one of those TikToks because you want to give all your information to the Chinese government for some reason. But anyway, get that on the internet because people need to see courage begets courage. And if you see, 16-year-olds like yourself standing up, other 16-year-olds are going to want to stand up. It's going to be good for everything. Another thing, though, you can do is that thing I said about my daughter's friend who confessed that she's done with pronouns. It was like a big deal for her to confess that. Make sure your friends to a person know that they can doubt this with you, they can make fun of it with you. Make fun of it, make memes and stuff. Don't go too far. Don't become one of them guys, but you know what I mean? That actually is a big deal. A lot of people, especially your age, are going along with it because they don't know how not to. And just being somebody who, as you young people say, is based and is willing to be based with one another. And no, I'm not doing that, let's just go make fun of this stupid stuff. And you're going to come up with better jokes than I can. I'm old. So do that. It seems like it's stupid, like it doesn't have any effect, but that's actually where the grassroots grows. And so I strongly encourage it. But stand up. Get you on a jacket. Go to the school board meeting and prepare a statement. Yeah, it'll be great. It'll be great. You'll be a hero.
One more thing to do next, and then we'll probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I'm looking for hands, so feel free to raise them and I'll come find you.
First of all, thank you for coming. We are active in the school board. We are complaining month after month after month. We've been going after the mandates. This is our next war. So what would you say when you just told him, we only get 2 to 3 minutes max. So what would you say to dumb it down to their level for people to understand? We're already going after the board. We're going after recalls. We're going after the superintendent. We're going after surety bonds. So what do we do next, and how do we get more parents involved?
How do you dumb it down? You asked me that. That's rude. That's the opposite of my job. No, what you have to do, what I do when I try to simplify these things, what I try to do, and I testified at the Orange County School Board in California, so I understand that 3 minutes is tough. You have to pick, so an activist mother friend of mine says that you need, what does she call it, 3 points and a prayer. So what you need to do is you need to figure out 3 simple things that you want to say. This is Marxism, this is why it's Marxism. You got 3 minutes, so spend about 40 seconds on each of those points, whatever it happens to be. So boil down to 3 key talking points. Get organized, plan it in advance, practice it. Don't just show up like I do and wing it. You can do that too, yeah, organize, plan it where, back to back. Get your messages running. If you get 4 or 5 different people, so people could hear what she said, if 4 or 5 different people show up together, you deliver the introduction, she delivers the next chunk of meat. Over here we got the potatoes, and you're going through the whole meal. By the time you get to dessert, everybody's got a real lesson in what's going on. You can organize that way as well. And what you want to do is make sure to hit key points, and that this recipe is actually very effective as far as meeting, talking to the board goes, which is 3 points and a prayer, which is 3 key points that you want to boil it down to make, to deliver, and then 1 thing you want to see change as a result. That's your prayer, apparently. That's how that works. And so it is a skill. It's a difficult skill. How do you get more parents involved? Well, the first thing is you realize that you don't go there to talk to the board. You go there to talk to the parents. You go there to talk to the people that are going to watch it when it goes viral on the internet, because you make sure that it goes to some of these groups like Moms for Liberty, or parents defending education or whatever, and they'll put it up on the internet and it goes viral. So speak, figure out who you're trying to speak to. If your goal is to get more parents organized, more parents involved, that's the way to do it. If you can find somebody who can speak in 3 minutes, it's not actually that hard about how this reproduces Maoism. Like, do you know that you're bringing Maoism into the schools? Here's how it works. You give people bad identities, you let them out with good identities. It's not complicated. And this is what you're doing with this program in our school. Why are you doing it? Speak, though, to the audience that you're trying to reach. You're probably not going to change very many school board members' minds. In my experience, they're usually already have their minds made up a little bit. But you can use that platform to gain visibility and get other parents to be interested. And so then maybe it's just 2 or 3 of you. And then next time you're filling 18 of the 20 spots. And just let it keep growing. And then, like I said, put out that information so that people can find you. Think of the Utah Parents United. There should be a Kansas Parents United or something like that. I know it's from Missouri, of whatever side you're on. You border towns. There's a side, people. But there should be a Parents United kind of. I really think there should be United States Parents United. Like, parents should be building across the board. And always think in terms of doing your messaging such that it will build and get more people in that. We're going to bring more resources to bear on pushing back on these things, and also becoming the school board members who next time when they're in that seat and you talk to them, they will hear you, they will listen, they're not craven, they're not cowardly, they didn't get in it for the wrong reasons, they get in it to straighten out our schools and protect our kids. So I would, what I would tell you most importantly though is don't lose heart. It feels really hard to yell into a hurricane at first. But my experience has been that if you keep telling the truth long enough, if you keep doing it, believe it or not, it starts moving. It starts moving in the other direction. If you just keep pushing, it will start going. So don't lose faith, keep pushing, keep going. I hope that's a good answer for you.
All right, we've got time for one more question.
Hi, this is in continuation to the gentleman from 2 questions ago and the conversation that follows suit. I'm a 14-year-old student formerly of Blue Valley, but now in Lewisburg. And what I was wondering is, I have noticed that there is a bit of counter-revolution within the youth, mostly through the internet of what I've seen, some of it in real life, with, yes, what you said earlier, the base memes, the Wojak memes on the internet. There is counter-revolution going on. But what I want to know is it strong enough? Like, could you say how many people actually, how many youths are actually involved or have been completely manipulated, or if there are any that are just, that have no idea what is going on, and what can I do to help?
So I actually, my bigger fear right now is that the counter-revolution, if you want to call it that, the countermeasure, I'm actually more afraid that it's going to be too strong at this point. I'm no longer worried about whether or not it's going to be strong enough. I'm more worried that the Wojaks are going to get out of control, and we're going to have a bunch of, let me pardon my French now, I know you're 14, a bunch of little shitlords screwing stuff up for us. Because they think that they're based by saying edgy stuff, but that's not being based. They don't understand any principles. And so they really need to be, I'm more worried that what we're going to have is kind of like a wildfire going in the other direction. It's unprincipled and crazy. So I'm less worried that there are going to be enough, especially in y'all's age demographic, 14, 16, 18, that up to about 20, 22. I'm pretty encouraged with people mostly in your generation. Of course, lots of you are on the left and have lost your marbles, but more of you than you probably fear are more based than you think. The younger kids are the ones that I'm actually more worried about. The ones that are, like I said in the talk, they're 8, they're 9, they're 10. It's when they get to be y'all's age. The goal is to make sure that they are completely cooked. And so, what's something you can do in addition to what I told him? Just speak the truth, be there for your friends, show up to some meetings, school board meetings or whatever else, get involved in clubs and speak truly there. Is I would try to find ways actually to reach the younger kids too. The kids that are a couple grades below you. How can you be like a based like teen mentor, right? Like that's actually a big deal. And the real answer is to friendships, of course. But so make friends with some of the younger kids, and again, give them a place to speak, to tell the truth. Tell them, this is the crap that they're trying to pull on us. It's not good. We can do better than this, and it stinks that this is what they're doing to us, but we're going to come out stronger and better as a result of standing up to it. You're getting a real world civics education, unlike any of us soft old people. We didn't get this. So, do your best part that you can. It's the same message though. You have to just tell the truth, and you have to be not afraid to tell the truth, and you have to do that with other people to the best of your ability. And I tell you, it's going to seem weird and rough at first, but it gets better and better and better the more you do it. But I'm very confident that there's going to be a very large pushback, including from people your age. It's actually kids younger than 12 right now that I'm primarily worried about, because a lot of the people your age are seeing this. They're seeing how many people have been canceled. I hear this all the time. Actually, the statistics show that people your age are the most against cancel culture of any age. And it's because all of you have been canceled like 17 times already. And it sucks. And so, play your part. All you have to do, it's one of these things that's so easy that it's hard. It's just, you just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. It really works. It sounds corny, but it's real. And try not to become a shitlord.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it this evening. So for everyone who's signed up on the check-in sheet down in the lobby, we will be emailing this video out to everyone, so we'll have that. I know he talked a lot and just barely scraped the surface of Marxism, how this is kind of filtered into our schools. So please visit his website, and we'll be having more information for you folks. And I'll let you know, James will be, some of his information will be making its way to legislators here in the state of Kansas, so that they can get legislation passed. There are 4 bills right now in the legislature working their way through the process right now to combat some of this stuff. The left has actually already picked up on it because now what they are considering to be curriculum transparency, they're considering that now to be anti-CRT and anti-teachers. So that's something that's being worked on, but there's other initiatives that will be coming. So we'll hopefully be pushing that information out to you. But the Kansas City Star will most definitely be writing articles about the education that's happening. So thank you again for all coming this evening. We do have to be out of here by 9, so if some of you do want to meet with James, please make it brief. He has to get to bed as well this evening. But again, thank you all for coming.